Grace, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here with you tonight. And it's great to hear that the war economy is back, because that means neoliberalism is over, right? We're going to get a big state back. We're going to get military Keynesianism, and we like Keynesianism, don't we? Because that's social democracy. This is all very exciting. It's literally the end of neoliberalism. That's obviously not what I really think, right? My most recent book, Vulture Capitalism, dismantles this claim, this idea that capitalism is a free market system, that the state and the market are two separate spheres of power, and that, when you get more state, that means less market and vice versa. And looks at the neoliberal movement and its claims that they were coming in to deliver on a promise of human freedom, to free up markets, shrink the state, allow you all as individuals to achieve, the heights of what you could possibly think, because all of the horrible bureaucratic stuff would just get out of the way and the market would allow you to rise to the top. We really need to stop believing what these guys tell us about what they want to do, because we know that they speak in kind of double speak. Neoliberalism was never about shrinking the state or freeing the market. Neoliberalism was about crushing opposition, restoring order and hierarchy, and augmenting the power of the ruling class over everyone else. It emerged in a very particular moment. It emerged in a moment of disorder, of ungovernability. We had societies all over the rich world, all over Europe, that were rocked by industrial disputes, powerful labor movements shutting down the whole economy, peace movements, environmentalists standing up to authority and saying, you don't get to tell us what to do. We don't accept your authority. We don't accept your legitimacy. Neoliberalism was about restoring the discipline, the order, and the authority of the ruling classes over the rest of society. It was about reminding everyone else who was in charge. That's why our governments broke up protest movements. It's why in my country, the UK, Margaret Thatcher used the ruthless power of the British state to crush the labor movement, sending unemployment through the roof, literally sending police to beat striking miners. Do you think that stopped because we've got the war economy and military Keynesianism? Do we feel like we live in a world where we have this dream of freedom and, individual effort and a state that is stepping back and allowing us to do our own thing? No, of course not. The war economy goes hand in hand with the extended and expanded crushing of the opposition, with the deepening of the control of the ruling class over every area of life. If you don't believe me, go and ask people living in Russia. When there was a columnist the other day in the UK who wrote in the Financial Times, if Europe wants to build out the warfare economy, it's going to have to shrink the welfare economy. You know who did that really well? Vladimir Putin. You know what else he had to do to crush dissent that would come out when poor people start to see their pensions cut, their teachers' salaries cut? He didn't cut the salaries of the people who exist to crush that form of protest. That is the route that that Europe is potentially going down. The problem was never that the state was too small or too big. The problem wasn't an imbalance between the state and the market. The problem was and is an imbalance of power between people and elites, or as the old school Marxist in me would say, between labor and capital. The war economy is a great example of how capitalism really works. It's based on deep cooperation between the public and private sector in pursuit of augmenting the power, the imperial power of particular governments, and obviously the wealth and power of individual capitalists. One example that I talk about in my book, and a company that's going to benefit from the expansion of the war economy, is Boeing. Some of you may remember a few years ago the 737 MAX disasters when 2 Boeing planes nosedived out of the sky, killing nearly 350 people. You might remember recently that Boeing whistleblowers have been in the news because they've been in court testifying against the company, and many of them have died. You might have seen that a door blew out of a Boeing plane. mid-flight. All of this stuff was basically shoddy engineering that came about during the shareholder value revolution of the 1980s, corporate greed, crush the unions, ignore the engineers, insert layers and layers of middle management, and focus on this one goal of maximizing value for shareholders. Fair enough, that just sounds like classic free market capitalism, right? That's just a bad corporation. And if we just had competent governments that could regulate them better, then everything would have been fine. But that's not quite right with Boeing. Because Boeing was, in the years of the 737 MAX disasters, the biggest recipient of corporate welfare in the US. That means it got money from the government in the form of tax breaks and subsidies. It also was an integral part of the military-industrial complex. It had tons of government contracts. And the regulator that was supposed to be regulating this company, the FAA, it was run according to a logic of self-regulation. You might be familiar with that because it's the same philosophy that underpinned how the banks were regulated before the financial crisis of 2008. In the run-up to these disasters, Boeing was being regulated by a unit of the FAA that sat inside Boeing and whose workers were being paid by Boeing. That's self-regulation for you. The relationship between Boeing and the American state was and is extremely close. There's a revolving door between the upper echelons of the Boeing Corporation and the upper echelons of the American state. It's not the case that greater regulation or a more effective separation between state and market would have dealt with this issue. This is how capitalism works. It's not a free market system. It's based on the existence of massive multinational corporations that are effectively monopolies or oligopolies that have immense amounts of control over their markets, over their workers, over the planet, and are able to work with and influence governments to do what they want. This was very clear in the case of Boeing. Don't think Europe is excluded, by the way. Don't think this is just an American issue, because Airbus, Boeing's only real competitor, has been embroiled in all sorts of corruption scandals as well. And we know how powerful corporate lobbyists are in this very city. It's also something that we can see very clearly today, right? You know, I wrote this book, I started writing it 3 years ago, and as it's come out, like, Elon Musk is literally in the White House working with Donald Trump. Even I wouldn't have predicted that it would be so naked and so obvious. But what I did write about in the book is, I think, quite illuminating and shows that this isn't actually as novel as you might think. Because if you go back nearly 100 years, there is another Musk-like figure who was very close to the American state as well. His name was Henry Ford. He was also a Nazi sympathizer, named by Hitler in Mein Kampf as a good guy. He was, I think, the kind of archetypical capitalist in the sense that he wasn't really about free markets. He was about the assertion of order and discipline and control. He was an ardent anti-unionist, actually hired thugs to go and beat up striking workers, just as Elon Musk has been named as one of the world's worst union busters. He even enforced certain standards on his workers. He said, you can get $5 a day, but you're not allowed to drink, your wife isn't allowed to work outside the home. All of these measures, they had nothing to do with free markets or efficiency or productivity. They were about control. They were about power. That is what capitalism is about. That is what the craziness that we're seeing at the moment about the war economy is about. That is why our elites have worked so hard to shut down dissent over conflict, to crush Palestinians, because the idea is we're in charge and you'll take what you're given. You won't get it because you protest. Protest doesn't work. You won't get it because you organize. Unions don't work. You'll take what we give you. Concessions that are given by us to you because we're the good guys, right? That's what this system is. The war economy represents a complete and utter continuation of this model. And I think it speaks to some of the strategic failures of the left, as Yanis was just mentioning, that we've ended up in this kind of cul-de-sac of people saying, right, well, the German debt brake is gone. Great. Fantastic. This is what we've been campaigning for ages. This is the end of neoliberalism because governments are spending lots of money again. Governments have been spending lots of money for a very long time. They just haven't been spending money to support workers. They've been spending money, dishing out vast sums of money to capitalists. Go back to the 2008 financial crisis. Go back to the pandemic, right? When all of the countries in Europe ended up distributing tons of cash to their big companies. Those companies then went on to lay off workers, avoid taxes, dish out money to shareholders. This happened everywhere. This cooperation between governments and states is very much alive and well. This isn't a new theory of capitalism, by the way. Other than Yanis, I have another favorite Greek Marxist political economist. His name is Nikos Palantzas, and he wrote a very long time ago that the capitalist state was a social relation. What does that mean? He was making a comparison with the way that Marx talks about capital, that capital is a social relation. It's based on this particular relationship between workers and bosses, right? And in the same way, what happens within the state is based on the balance of power between society as a whole. So we aren't getting these terrible outcomes for working people because governments are just doing the wrong policies. We're getting these terrible outcomes for working people because working people aren't organized. Their interests aren't represented within the halls of power. And they're still not represented in the halls of power. So when governments announce we're going to do more spending and we're going to spend loads of money on the military, we can't suddenly think, great, that's going to mean the working class is suddenly going to get what they want. It's going to suddenly change this system that has caused so much pain and misery, stagnation for such a very, very long time. The war economy, by the way, is also a very inefficient way of doing Keynesianism. It's going to eat up a lot of resources that ultimately get destroyed or worn out, doesn't create as many jobs. Europe remains incredibly reliant on American military technology. A lot of it gets sucked abroad. You know what would be a really good alternative? How is Putin funding this war? By selling Europe and the rest of the world fossil fuels. Europe has actually sent more money to Russia in the form of fuel payments than it has given to Ukraine in aid since the beginning of this war. Why doesn't Europe consider decarbonization? That would reduce our reliance on autocrats all over the world who depend on fossil fuels. That would deal with one of the biggest and most significant threats, probably the most biggest and significant threat to us, which is climate breakdown, and would create 3 times as many jobs than any other form of stimulus program. Why not? Well, because doing so would not be in the interests of the European ruling elite and its friends within the arms industry. You know, when Keir Starmer says we're going to cut aid and boost defense spending, who's going to benefit that? BAE Systems. BAE Systems also has a very close relationship with the British state. It was at the center of what was called one of the largest and most corrupt arms deals in history between the UK and another massive fossil fuel producer, Saudi Arabia. This corruption is endemic to this industry, and it's part of why these calls for the war economy are happening so loudly now. I think it's very clear that most European politicians are not interested in the living standards of most people, in their jobs or their wages. That's not why we're not why we're hearing calls for the war economy today. They want their defense companies to be strong and powerful so they can beat other defense companies. Liberals really like to quote Orwell. I don't like doing it so much, but I think now is a good time when he said the war is not meant to be won. It's meant to be continuous. Vladimir Putin would probably agree with that, and I'm sure that a lot of our political leaders today are starting to reflect that logic. Another thing that Palantzas said when he talked about the capitalist state, he said it was a social relation, that most of the time what happens within the capitalist state reflects the balance of power within society. In a capitalist society, that tends to mean outcomes reflect the interests of capital. But the capitalist state, he said, is also used as a tool to divide and disperse workers. And that's a very, very important tool that is being used today. Most people in our societies, in our economies, most people don't actually think that this model is working, right? If you go and ask people almost anywhere, even in the rich world across Europe, do you think the economy works for you? They'll say no, right? People don't stick with this model because they think it's working. They stick with this model because they can't imagine an alternative. Why can't they imagine an alternative? Let's go back to when we had the birth of neoliberalism. Things weren't like this. People could imagine alternatives. They are out on the streets every day fighting for those alternatives, fighting for alternatives when it came to the peace movement, fighting for alternatives when it came to the climate, fighting for alternatives in their workplace. You know, we had strong unions, but they weren't just fighting for higher wages. They were fighting for control over the production process. These were educated workers who say, we can run this company better than you. And actually, they proved that they could on a number of different occasions. What happened? Neoliberalism was a really effective project at convincing us that we are all alone, that we are isolated, that we are divided, that we are little mini capitalists, right? We have our houses, we have our pension pots, and if we just sit down and focus on the stock market and don't look at anything else that's going on around us, our lives will get better. And for a while it worked. Until 2008, that bargain held. But since then it has not held. And yet we still feel alone and disempowered. So in swoops the far right, with its promises about belonging, about community, you being part of something, part of a great nation, with this long history, this long trajectory, feeling strong again, feeling like you're part of something. The left hasn't been able to do that in most cases. We've instead been going and talking at people, saying, if you vote for us, we'll protect you, we'll save you, we'll expand the size of the state, we'll undo neoliberalism, often using words that people have never even heard before. And that's why I think we are seeing the far right exploit this crisis so much more effectively than the left. Because often far right politicians are in communities telling people, you see that playground over there that hasn't had any investment in a very long time, that your kids can't use anymore? The reason that that's happened is because of migrants. Your rent's gone up. Why? Because of migrants. Where is the left? The left used to be there. Back in those moments when we were strong, when we were powerful, when we were effective, we were in communities, we were in workplaces, we were there talking to people, and not just saying, vote for this political party and we'll give you nice things. Saying, right, well, we actually organized a protest last week to save your community center, and that's why your kids have somewhere to go after school. And if we can all work together to try and do that at the next election, then we can extend those gains. And in fact, not we can extend those gains, you can extend those gains. Because you are part of something that is very powerful. You are part of a class, part of a movement that spans history, part of a class that won restrictions on working time, that's fought battles against capitalists, against states all over the world, that's won socialized healthcare, that's won education, that has won so much. And yet over the last 50 years, you have been convinced that you are powerless, and you're not. That's what we need to be saying. So I'm obviously, as always, I have a policy background. I'm super enthusiastic about talking about policies, how we can make a project for renewing a fair and sustainable economy effective, how we can push back against the war economy with a project of kind of genuine green democratic Keynesianism. But before we can do any of that, we need to deal with the fundamental issue, which is this imbalance of power within society and the conviction that is held by so many people that they are alone fighting against this profoundly unfair system. That kind of organizing is about rebuilding trust. It's about being there with people. And that probably sounds just like words, but here in this country, actually, there's a political party who I know and love very well, the PTB, who are doing a pretty good job of this. I went and interviewed some of their leaders. And they said, they've got things like medicine for the people, where it's literally, they have doctors that go into workplaces that have serious occupational health hazards and say, we're going to help you, and also you should probably form a union because otherwise these things are going to carry on happening. They're in communities doing things like stopping community centers getting shut down. The parallel of this in Greece with the far right was Golden Dawn during austerity, when they were out there delivering medicines to people. If the left does not do this, then the far right will. The good news is that we are doing it in lots of different places, because I think the spirit of the left, far from this sense of, wanting centralized power to be able to plan everything. No, the spirit of the left is anti-authoritarianism. It is about being established in a community, bringing people together and saying, we can fight back and build something better. And that is happening everywhere. If you just look in your communities, I can guarantee you there's something cool happening. Whether that's a community-owned energy company, whether it's a tenants union, whether it's a new labor union. This stuff is happening everywhere. And I really think that rather than just, as fun as it is to be here standing on stages and talking about what we are going to do for people, I think we as the left need to be out there bringing those movements together and telling people, showing people that they can change things, that they are part of this historic movement, and that they have power in a system that wants them to believe that they have none. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Grace.